Right, so my name is Elena Sudakova. I am director of Pushkin House, and it's very exciting to be back in this venue, which we love, as it allows us to host more of you here, and which we use for really special occasions. We recently had our Pushkin House Book Prize ceremony in here when Elena Kostyuchenko was announced as a winner with her book I Love Russia. And just a couple of weeks ago, we hosted here Sergei Guriev in conversation with Gulnaz Sharafutdinova, also discussing potential scenarios for the future of Russia. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our speakers tonight, Mark Galeotti and Anna Arutunyan, to talk about their new book, Downfall, Prigozhin, Putin, and the New Fight for the Future of Russia, which came out in Ebury Press this year. Mark Galeotti is a specialist on the Russian military and security services, an honorary professor at the UCL, and executive director of the UK-based consultancy Mayak Intelligence. Mark is also the author of over 25 books on Russia and has his own podcast, which is called In Moscow's Shadows. Anna Arutunyan is a Russian-American journalist, author, and analyst. She covered the 2014 war for USA Today from Crimea and Donetsk, and has since analyzed the conflict for the International Crisis Group. She is the author of several books about Russia as well, one of which, Hybrid Warriors, is available for sale today at the stand at the back. And actually, we have several books available today by Anna and Mark, who kindly agreed to sign them at the end of the event. So, Anna and Mark, over to you.
Well, thanks very much indeed. In case anyone was wondering, I'm Mark, and this is Anna. And I drew the short straw in order to start the introduction. It's going to be framed, the first 45-ish minutes or so will be a conversation between the two of us, which on one level is slightly artificial, but you know, please bear with us. And on another level, you know, it's a little bit different from when you have a separate interviewer, because the separate interviewer can sort of say all the things about, well, what a wonderful book it is, whereas it would seem immodest for us to say so. But trust me, that is what we're thinking. So yes, we're going to sort of back and forth a bit, and what I thought was one of the more interesting ways of starting is, Anna, you know, perhaps you'd like to talk a bit first about quite why we separately and then together decided to write a book about this thoroughly disagreeable human being.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to try to answer that as best I can. As you know, sometimes I still wonder, I have to say about this last point. I have to say that it started with us both getting offers and proposals to write about Prigozhin. And the funny thing is, at first, neither of us really wanted to do anything like that. We were, you know, both writing a lot of, we were just busy writing a lot at the time. And B, it was, you know, he was alive at that point. And, you know, we were really wondering, okay, how do we approach this? How to avoid, you know, in some ways the nastiest stereotypes that are going to be that were abounding at that time. Finally, we felt both that if we approach this together, having studied this time period in Russian history, having studied the Putin system, we found that this is actually a great opportunity to talk about and try to understand how the Putin system works. Because at its heart, this was a hybrid relationship between head of state or the state and a non-state actor who rose to basically become another arm of the state. And given how much this idea and this concept was misunderstood, we felt that, you know, we were well placed to address this point. I had gathered a lot of materials about Prigozhin and Wagner and their role in the conflict in Ukraine over the last 10 years, but I decided not to use that in my previous book, Hybrid Warriors, and I thought that basically because I think Prigozhin, there was so much material that it would warrant a whole new book. So we decided to write it together, and we do not regret it. And to that end, I wanted to turn it back to Mark and ask him, what is your favorite passage in the book? And maybe, talk about what kind of made, why this, what in particular about him?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously the whole book is written wonderfully. And I should add, actually, in terms of this collaboration, because we do come from different sort of directions and different traditions. And I mean, I think that will emerge more sort of directly later on. But actually, Anna, a journalist who until some strange reason, until spring 2022, was based in Moscow, very much contacts within the sort of the political realm and such like. Me, being more of a dilettante, sort of traveling in, living a bit here, living a bit there, and so forth, but not actually being rooted in Moscow, but on the other hand, working much more on the security and similar sides. We did, I think, very much bring different kind of perspectives to bear, as well as just different sort of contacts. But anyway, in terms of passages, I decided to actually pick something towards the end of the book. This is where I juggle a book and a microphone. And it's after the great boon that was Prigozhin's death. It's worth mentioning it. It wasn't very nice for Prigozhin, but it was great for us. Because it did sort of, again, there were people who were willing to talk rather more freely once he was no longer around. Prigozhin is not a man who liked people talking about him in anything other than his own narrative terms. So this is after he's dying, and this is in the basically the final substantive chapter called Ghost. Here is the irony. Prigozhin was no philosopher or moralist, and his men were largely cutthroats and desperados. They were no closet humanitarians, quite the opposite. The vision they had for Russia was often a horrifying one, of a war of conquest to reclaim former Soviet territories, or of a revanchist neo-Soviet order cleansing itself from the enemy within with Stalinist savagery. Prigozhin himself memorably said that Comrade Stalin was absolutely right about the need to execute those getting in the way of the war effort. Yet there is one common thread that connects all the varied forms of opposition to Putin's regime, from liberal opposition leader Alexei Navalny, through the few within the Communist Party who've not been bought off by the state, to the moderate nationalists, and all the way to the turbo-patriots. A desire to see greater fairness come to Russia. It may sound banal, and there's ample room to disagree on what the unfairness is embodied within Putin's system may be, from economic inequality to the absence of meaningful democracy. Yet it stems from a common sense that whatever Putin still offers, it is hollow, and that he somehow shortchanged the nation. Prigozhin's march of justice was many things, but it was also sincere. In his diatribes, Prigozhin may have been lashing out at Shoigu and Gerasimov, but he was more generally giving voice to a mounting sense of injustice, the recognition of a vapid, dishonest system, of which Shoigu and Gerasimov were an integral part, a system that claimed to be about justice and values, but which was in reality one in which serfs would always be serfs and masters would always be masters. Now, the reason I picked that is because the subtitle of the book is Prigozhin, Putin, and the New Fight for the Future of Russia. And I think one of the key things that we have to appreciate is we have in the past tended to look at the evolution of Russia as very much a simple binary. Is it Putinist authoritarianism, or is it happy, smiley, liberal democracy? And of course, I mean, if I can choose, I would very much like to see happy, smiley, liberal democracy. However, we have to appreciate that there are other forms of opposition to what Putin offers, including opposition from, perversely, the nationalist end of things. People who didn't have a problem with invading Ukraine, but did have a problem with the corruption, the incompetence, the amateurishness, which was evident within it. Now, some of them perversely actually do believe in democracy. I mean, there is a weird, I'm not going to go into the full sort of strangenesses of Russian nationalist thinking, but there are some people who think precisely that the corruption was permitted because there are no checks and balances on Putin's system, and therefore you have the odd spectacle of ultranationalists arguing for parliamentary democracy. God bless Russia, it always provides something of interest. But I think that the reason why Prigozhin has now become, in death, a martyr and an icon, the reason why people do still go to his grave and leave flowers and cards and such like, the reason why so many people are still willing to believe that he didn't actually die in that plane, you know, it goes all the way back to after the death of Ivan the Terrible in the time of troubles and the false Dimitris. People who are so desperate for a legitimate Tsar that when someone comes along and says, no, I was Ivan's son, and no, I didn't die when everyone said I died, I quote, cut my own throat in an epileptic fit. I mean, that beats all this falling out of windows, whatever. But, you know, however transparent, people were so desperate for what they felt was a legitimate ruler that they would believe all sorts of nonsense. Well, in some ways, the struggle now to kind of reinvent Prigozhin as this strong-minded nationalist who rolled up his sleeves to do what the nation needed, but was also strong enough to tell truth to power, I think that's a really powerful and potentially very dangerous element within sort of unfolding Russian political culture. But it's precisely the kind of thing that I think made, for me and for Anna, writing this book an interesting exercise, because in part it's about crawling into the deep, dark life of a, as I say, deeply unpleasant man. And we didn't want to write a hagiography, but nor did we want to pretend that some of his critiques weren't accurate, and more to the point that people are going to believe different things about him. We don't have to believe the same things, but we have to acknowledge that there are some people who may well build up Prigozhin as precisely the hero who tried to save Russia, rather than the thuggish opportunist that he really was. So okay, so that's my favoured section. What's yours?
So from the future and the present, we go deep into the past. I wanted to read a few paragraphs from chapter 3, The Chef, which I think chimes with this whole notion of once you're a serf, always a serf, master is always master, and this dichotomy that really kind of struck a chord during Prigozhin's March of Justice. The 19th century revolutionary thinker Alexander Gertsen recalls that his family had a serf, a bonded peasant, virtually a land slave, who happened to be an excellent cook. One of the more forward-thinking liberal members of his family, a senator, took such a liking to the budding chef that he got him an apprenticeship working in the kitchen of Emperor Alexander I himself, and then a position at the prestigious English club in Moscow. The chef's career, despite his being a serf, took off, and soon he was making enough money to live like an aristocrat. However, with the noose of serfdom still round his neck, he could never sleep easy or enjoy his position, writes Gertsen. He tried to buy his freedom, offering the senator 5,000 rubles, perhaps 100 times a typical serf's sale price. His benefactor, the senator, was proud of his possession and refused, instead promising manumission for free in his will. So the serf was rich and free in practice, but not by law or in his heart. He lived in the milieu of the rich and privileged, but would never feel like he was anyone's equal, and assured that everyone would look at him as a serf. In the end, he drank away all his possessions, his job, and an advantageous marriage, and the senator had to take him back in out of pity. Gertsen described his childhood impressions of the man. I saw then what concentrated hatred and malice against the masters lay in the heart of a serf. Now, Russian folklore is filled with such tales of a lowly serf rising to the Tsar. While these fairy tales usually have happy endings, as Gertsen's account suggests, the real ones were fraught with tragedy and danger. It is rare that social climbers ever feel at home among the elites, who will eternally regard them as suspect outsiders, even as they take advantage of them. There are, of course, exceptions. Vladimir Putin's grandfather Spiridon spent 5 years training as a chef in the kitchen of the pre-revolutionary St. Petersburg before going on to cook for Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, and subsequent general secretaries. He lived to the ripe old age of 86, although then again, if the old man did feel any class resentment, we would have no way of telling. Maybe it was for this reason, his grandfather's self-propelled rise to the kitchens of the czars, that Putin took a liking to the gregarious businessman placing a napkin on his lap. At least Prigozhin seemed to think so. Vladimir Putin, he recalls, saw how I turned a kiosk into a business, he would boast years later, long before the resentment started to set in that would overflow and lead to his downfall. He saw how I do not hesitate personally to bring a plate to crowned heads because they came to visit me, and I tried my best. And the reason I kind of felt this passage was so central to the drama and tragedy that kind of evolved between Prigozhin and Putin, and which kind of, I think, lays at the heart of the Putin regime, is that it strikes at two things. One is that the Kremlin, from the Putin regime, from its beginnings in the late 90s, allied itself with private businessmen, often relying on non-state actors to fulfill its goals. This is in some ways to compensate for its own weaknesses, whether in cost or in political risk. For Putin, this became a way, in some sense, of basically outsourcing the most troublesome tasks that had little chance of success, and then taking credit for them if they were indeed successful, or cutting them loose if they were not. And Prigozhin, in this sense, was the perfect embodiment of that relationship. The convict who became an entrepreneur, who became not a chef but a restaurateur, who entered into almost the inner circle but was never quite one of them, who wound up seeing his own private army dying in Ukraine, but never actually being able to take the credit for it, watching the Ministry of Defense taking the credit for the lives that his men had sacrificed. This was bound to create the tension and ultimately the conflict that we saw in June of 2023 with Prigozhin's revolt. But I think also in a wider sense, it unmasked a persistent relationship in which the state relied on non-state actors, thinking that they were soldiers and thinking that they could just treat them as serfs, when in fact a lot of these people had their own agenda, their own initiative, that the Kremlin would find time and again did not always align with its own interests.
Okay, what we were thinking next is we would just give a little bit of a sort of whistle-stop trip through Prigozhin's life. We're not going to try and cover all the details, A, because we don't have time, and B, because we want you to buy the book. But nonetheless, you know, looking at some of the particular kind of pivotal moments. So, Anna, do you want to kind of kick us off about the sort of his very early, his childhood really, and his origins? You know, where did he come from?
I would love to read it. Another passage on this, but I won't. I think this is interesting. When we imagine a thug like this, we think of a broken home, poverty, the rough life on the other side of the tracks. And in Prigozhin's case, this was just not so. He was born into a middle-class, almost intelligentsia family, if you stick to the, class notions of the day in the early 60s. His mother was a doctor, his father an engineer, right? And in some ways, this was kind of, this was not your typical proletarian family, and nor was it your nomenclatura, your rich either factory director, store director, or party boss. And in some ways, this class got the worst of both worlds. Prigozhin grew up in a strata where he was expected to succeed, and yet the actual opportunities for him to make money, to become rich, to achieve something were pretty dire. He grew up watching others making money in illegal ways when he knew full well that someone of his own stature could never legally make that amount of money. This was kind of the curse of the boy from a relatively nice family. And yet, given that his father died, this was mostly a single income household where it's almost as though he was resigned to watching others have nice things that he could never, not so much even afford, but that money couldn't really buy. So early on, he found himself involved in a criminal gang. And I think that in some part this was kind of a response, and we see both his will and his anger come out in that moment, almost a resistance and revolt against this system, this hypocrisy that he found himself in, where he's forced to achieve and yet he can't, where he wants nice things but he can't get them, and so he began to steal them. And this is essentially, this kind of established him as a criminal from the start, something he would never be able to shake. So in that, I wanted to ask Mark about, to talk more about Prigozhin's life in prison, because I think this is a period that actually ended up framing his whole trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, my view is, in many ways, I mean, he found himself in the prison system, if one can put it in those terms. I mean, this is a guy who, as you said, Anna, that he's not able to succeed out there. I mean, he's smart, but he's not quite smart enough to get into one of the sort of elite universities that represent kind of fast-track sort of social elevators. He's enrolled in this sports boarding school for training the kind of next generation of Olympic athletes and so forth, and he's a cross-country skier. And he's good at it, but he's not quite good enough to be able to make it as a professional athlete. You know, so time and time again, he's good enough to have hopes, but not quite good enough to achieve them. And so, as you say, you know, he gets into sort of fairly sort of petty crime, and his attributes, in some ways, made him perfect for the zone, for the prison camp system. He's caught for the first time, and he's given a suspended sentence, goes back to a life of crime, caught again, and this time, because the Soviet system is definitely tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime, he goes to a hard labor penal colony. But the point is, from the beginning, I mean, he in some ways, he already has a sense of, he knows the ropes. There's a whole kind of ritual within the zone at this time. This is the sort of high day still of the Vorovskoy Mir, the thieves' world, this sort of underworld culture. And yet, Prigozhin has knocked around criminals enough that he kind of already knows the things that identify you. I mean, for example, usually when a new prisoner comes into the barracks block, these labor camps, you don't have individual cells, you have barracks blocks, there will be a clean white towel laid down almost like a doormat, with the assumption that most sort of newbies will not want to basically sort of tread their dirty boot prints across it. Whereas someone who feels sort of at home there will just casually wipe his feet on it and then ask where his bunk is. Things like that, Prigozhin knew what to do. And also, he demonstrated two crucial characteristics. One of them is the capacity to intimidate. I mean, this is a man who is comfortable with violence and comfortable with the threat of violence. I mean, at an early point, the police, it really is a sort of an attempt to try and sort of scare him straight. Classic tactic is they put him in a holding cell with a bunch of hardened criminals with the expectation that this sort of early 20-year-old, would be scared by the hardened ex-cons and so forth. In fact, when they came back to check on it, basically he had intimidated the rest of the cell. So, this is a man who's going into a brutal, thuggish environment, but able to cope with that. But also, this is where he really finds his entrepreneurialism. At first, he kicks against the system, he's in and out of solitary cells and so forth, and then he realizes that's a bit of a mug's game. The system is always going to be more powerful than you. So instead, he tries to kind of work with the grain more, not kind of collaborating and becoming an informant, so much as actually just not fighting the system, but instead looking for opportunities. And what he does is he actually gets himself transferred to a logging camp. Even harder labor, and so when he applies, the system, the state is very happy to send him there because they need people who are willing to do that. And while he's there, he sets up a business inside the prison camp, whereby inmates would take little offcuts of wood, and in their spare time, they would carve them into little sort of tourist knickknacks and gewgaws that can be then sold on the outside. Now, to actually think, there you are in a Soviet labor camp, and you're thinking about setting up a business, in effect. But also, to do that, he had to negotiate with two particular power structures. One of them was the official prison regime, because anything that has to get smuggled out and money coming back in would need the connivance of the guards, who clearly would need to be paid off and everything else. But also, this was a so-called black camp. There's red camps and black camps. Red camps, very much the authorities are in charge. Black camps, inside the perimeter, it's the inmates themselves who basically dominate. And this was a black one, so he needed to also square it off with the criminal authorities who basically ran day-to-day life inside the camps. And he was able to do that. And I think this is what really brought up the deal maker who is comfortable with entrepreneurial flair and also comfortable with violence and intimidation, who can make deals with the powers that be, the authorities, the state, and yet also make deals with the powers that shouldn't be, the shadow powers of the underworld and so forth. I mean, which meant that when he comes out into the 1990s, this period of kind of anarchic chaos with the collapse of the Soviet Union, in some ways he is custom built for it. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about Prigozhin in the 1990s?
In the book, we talk about when Zhenya met Vova, and while their official meeting, as official hagiography claims to be, was in after 2000, after Putin became president, all evidence suggests that this happened much earlier in the 1990s. So at this point, Prigozhin opens a series of restaurants in St. Petersburg. And St. Petersburg in the early 1990s was kind of the nexus of what would end up becoming this hybrid relationship in Putin's Kremlin of business, security, and government officials. A weak government after the collapse of the Soviet Union had to rely on former KGB officers, now renamed the FSB, who never quite really left the service, or if they left, it wasn't really fully, as the saying goes, you're never, бывших не бывает, there's no such thing as a former officer. This was a symbiotic relationship because otherwise the state could not really survive while business did not have the protection it needed in the lawless environment that had emerged. Now, Prigozhin knew how to kind of work both of these worlds, the criminal world that you had to rely on and kind of rising through the connections he made in the restaurants to kind of build relationships with the right officials in order to conduct his business. And at the time, ironically, his restaurant became the best venue for the government and business elite in St. Petersburg. You saw people like Sobchak, his deputy mayor, the young Vladimir Putin, Putin's bodyguard, Viktor Zolotov. These were all, it just so happened that because private restaurants, private business was so young, to have a high-class restaurant in this Russia's second capital, you're going to have basically the cream of the crop gathering there. And so Prigozhin found himself essentially making their steaks, learning how they liked, what kind of French wines they liked, whether they liked their beef steak rare or well done, where they preferred their oysters to be imported from. But not just that. He learned how who to approach to procure the best contracts, et cetera, et cetera. And over time, his position in this Tusovka, simply by being a restaurateur, he managed to kind of emerge with his unlikely criminal and convict past into a sort of a mini-garch. And with that, I wanted to ask Mark, how is it that a mini-garch becomes a mercenary chief?
Yeah, I mean, he never planned to be a mercenary chief. It wasn't necessarily in his sort of business strategy. But as you say, I mean, through the 1990s, he rose by being very well aware to kind of build the right contacts. You know, he wasn't one of the social circuit of, for example, deputy mayor that became rather more, Vladimir Vladimirovich. But nonetheless, he understood that basically you offer them what they want, which is perhaps certain services and certain bribes and whatever else, and they look after you. As you said, a symbiotic relationship. And so through the noughts, once Putin is in power, this is a period where precisely Prigozhin becomes more and more prosperous. But his businesses are things like catering services for the state and for schools and for such like. And increasingly, frankly, even though he's catering for the police and the armed forces, he's doing so badly. You know, people are complaining about school kids, sort of whole schools going down with dysentery or whatever. And soldiers are finding weevils in their biscuits as if they're doing a rerun of Battleship Potemkin and so forth. But it doesn't matter because he has the right friends and so forth. And, you know, he identifies, and he does show a real knack for, in some ways, spotting today what you think that your clients and your patrons are going to want tomorrow. So you're there providing it. I mean, we saw this with the whole troll farm stuff. I mean, originally this was actually just his own venture, using his corporate black PR team, who basically specialized in sort of spreading scurrilous rumors about his rivals and such like, use them against the democratic opposition, because he knew that that would please the Kremlin, and that if you please the Kremlin, goodies come your way. But then in 2013, having toyed with the idea for ages, the Kremlin decided that it wanted to have its own deniable mercenary army. Remember, the Kremlin spends so much of its time mirror imaging what it thinks the Americans do. So they looked at, for example, the mercenary company Blackwater, that every time there's a scandal, it renames itself, so then it became Academy and Z or something like that. It's probably called something else now. And thought, oh, well, clearly this is just the Pentagon's deniable private army. That sounds fun. We should have one of those. And this was before the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, etc. So they were thinking of it precisely as something to be operating in Africa or Latin America or the Middle East or wherever. But they needed someone to run it. And they were looking around, and it seems to be, and look, there's multiple different explanations for how Wagner came about. The classic one is the one that Prigozhin himself tells, is that in 2014, he, being a good patriotic businessman, decided, no, we need to do something, and he set up some guys, and personally he helped clean rifles and everything else for them. Now, see, this is where the scrupulous element of the journalist is more scrupulous than me. I'm more of a hack. So I'm willing to kind of plump, even though we don't actually have solid evidence to say this is absolutely the way it was. But as far as I can tell, in 2013, they approached Prigozhin because they thought, well, look, this is a guy who's, he's in our pocket. We know he's entrepreneurial. He's probably a suitable guy just to be the sort of the corporate front man. And at first, Prigozhin was not interested. He was making huge amounts of money with all of his real estate and catering and other businesses. What does he know about mercenarying? That's also, it's much more kind of exposed and so forth. But ultimately, this is a man who his entire business model depended on the favor of the Kremlin. I mean, to put it in terms from a slightly different, but not that different milieu, it was an offer he couldn't refuse. And so ultimately, he has to say yes. He doesn't know anything about mercenarying, so fortunately, he's put in touch with a man by the name of Dmitry Utkin, who is this Spetsnaz Special Forces colonel who basically his career had run into a wall, because he was very gung-ho and everything else, but it didn't help that he was both abrasive and, I love this phrase, that one newspaper profile was about him, was that he chose the code name or sort of call sign Wagner because of his appreciation of the aesthetics of the Third Reich. I mean, this is a guy who had SS rune tattoos, for God's sake. In other words, yes, even in Putin's Russia, there's a limit to how far an avowed Nazi can get within special forces. So basically, he was at a loose end, exactly the kind of guy you would want to be your operational commander. And so, Wagner starts to be formed just at the moment when Revolution of Dignity, Crimean annexation, the rising kind of mix of civil war, civic disturbance, and foreign intervention that is what's happened in the Donbass. So ably discussed in Hybrid Warriors, available at the back of the room. And so in a way, the whole concept of Wagner changes at that moment. But that is actually how, because it was not meant to be this kind of visible, evident tool of the state in hostile operations in Ukraine. It was meant to be out there doing the things which it also did do in Africa and such like. But ultimately, it was just another business decision. So, okay, he ends up a mercenary commander. How does he also end up taking that mercenary command and basically leading it off a cliff?
I think by this point we are well into the period of when Prigozhin has outed himself as the man behind Wagner, something that he kind of hid and denied for many, many years. But basically, for lots of reasons, both because I think the Kremlin needed it to be so, and because Prigozhin was eager. By 2022, the end of that fall, he came out with it. I mean, what everybody knew all along, he was the man behind Wagner. So why did he go off the rails? Why did he start ranting at Putin, calling him a, in veiled, very veiled terms, thinly veiled, the happy Gramps, who is actually, as he said, an asshole, and then denied that this was about Putin, it was about somebody else. But, everybody kind of knows what happened. And I think that this, ultimately, this is it's almost a Shakespearean tragedy, that this was bound to happen. The very nature of this relationship, this deeply unequal, almost symbiotic, but in some ways parasitical relationship, was bound to end in this kind of drama. Because now, when Mark mentioned that Prigozhin was asked by the Kremlin, yes, there is some evidence that he was approached, there is some evidence that he was reluctant. There's also a lot of evidence that Prigozhin was in 2014 trying to create a private army, looking for business opportunities in eastern Ukraine. So I think in some ways both sides are true, that in some ways Prigozhin's business and in some ways genuine patriotic interests were met halfway with a Kremlin that was looking for a deniable asset. And this was precisely at the heart of this relationship. The Kremlin needed somebody who was close to the Kremlin, but not too close. Somebody who was an effective manager, a term from the late 90s, early 2000s that came to be reviled for its association with the Putin regime. This kind of, we're going to try to be what the worst of Western capitalism now, bringing in effective managers as we privatize state business. This is what the Kremlin wanted, and this is also in some ways what Prigozhin was also offering. Now again, there's not really a clear sense of how much he himself wanted to run a mercenary army. This is a position rife with danger and risk. I mean, at the time, mercenaries were and still are illegal under Russian state law. So it's completely easy to see how he would have been reluctant to be charged with doing this. And yet there were opportunities. I mean, by that point, he had created a media empire, his troll farm, that was first attacking the Russian liberal opposition, and then was later would find itself trolling Hillary Clinton during the US elections. And I think that, this is the key thing. I'm often asked by Western security experts or military experts, wow, Putin's got this amazingly professional private army. I mean, and the thing that's often misunderstood is that this is not just an arm of the state. I think that in some ways, both the Kremlin and those who are watching this situation from abroad, in some ways projecting American practices onto Russian practices, they tend to think of Prigozhin and his private army as directly carrying out the Kremlin's will. This was not always the case. Prigozhin had his own agendas, and very often, especially when the Russian state was not giving him enough money, he would find himself selling his services to Assad in Syria, to various African governments on the African continent, and doing so on his own initiative. Now, of course, he had some help with from the state, but in very many ways, this was driven by his own ambitions, his own agenda, and his own interests. Where they aligned with the Kremlin, great, but oftentimes they didn't, and this inevitably bred a sense of resentment. Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, we know never really liked Prigozhin. This was not really his style of doing things. Prigozhin didn't really like Shoigu. Shoigu was a man who got to take the credit for things that Prigozhin felt his guys were doing and then being disowned for. So in some ways, it was inevitable that this resentment, if it was never addressed, and it wasn't, was bound to come to a head. I think a very, very major point was what happened in 2018 in Syria, in Deir ez-Zor, when a unit of Wagner soldiers were attacked by Americans due to basically a miscommunication when the Russian MOD basically said, no, those aren't our guys. And with dozens or up to 200 Wagnerites dead, and then the MOD refusing to kind of in any way acknowledge that these were Russians, this was something Prigozhin could not really forgive. And it was a situation that in a lot of ways repeated once his men were out there in the open fighting in eastern Ukraine in 2022 and 2023. It came to a head. What really triggered it was when the MOD decided that, okay, it's time that we get rid of this whole. This is kind of getting a little bit out of hand. Why don't you guys sign official contracts with the Ministry of Defense? Prigozhin refused, and hence the march of justice. And I think what's important here, it was about ostensibly about Shoigu and Gerasimov. It was about the way that the military operation was being carried out. It was about corruption in the Ministry of Defense, but it was also about something bigger. It was this sense of deception, this lack of sincerity behind the whole conflict that really was much more about the whole of the Kremlin strategy. Prigozhin started asking questions that were on everybody's minds, that people were afraid to ask. Why are we fighting this war, and how do we expect to win it without turning into North Korea? So, in some ways it was almost challenging the very reason for starting this war. Not in the sense that Prigozhin was against it, but in the sense of he was there directly watching his men die in Bakhmut, and he's starting to ask, where are we going with this? And so I think that, going back to what Mark started with, the question of the future of Russia, this remains an unanswered question, not just about the war, but about the Kremlin's whole, this administration's sense of legitimacy and raison d'etre. Where is Russia going? How can we come up with some genuine vision, some genuine national identity that we can actually believe in? And I think that this is a question that, in whatever horrific way it was asked at the time, it's going to be addressed again. It's still out there, and we're going to be not seeing more of so much Prigozhin because he's gone. But in many ways, the questions that he asked, the turbo patriots will one day have to find themselves talking to the rest of society and figuring out, where are we going with all of this? What is Russia's future? And I think that, I guess at this point, I'd like to maybe ask Mark about getting back to more about how our process in writing this book, and how would you describe this?
Yeah, look, again, at the risk of sounding excessively cringeworthy, it actually did work out very smoothly. We're often asked this question: how do two people write one book? And the answer is, what we would do is, we had a common sense of where the book was going and how it was divided. Each chapter, we'd then talk about sort of, again, what we thought its overall shape would be. Then one of us would do the first draft. In most cases, you would do the first draft of the chapters, except for the more military ones that I would sort of take first stab at. And then it would be passed to the other for, polishing and a scattering of angel dust and occasional disagreements over things. For example, there's one very specific example which shows that only one of us has been to journalism school. One of the things that I think really got Prigozhin's goat about Shoigu was that Shoigu outmaneuvered him. And if one looks at Prigozhin's career, it's not that he is always successful. But on the other hand, when he's in an actual direct contest with someone else, he tends not to lose. Now, you don't pick a fight with Shoigu. Prigozhin is one style. It's all bluster and visible and threats and so forth. Shoigu, the defense minister, now currently the secretary of the Security Council, is very much the behind-the-scenes political operator. He has the longest political career of any of the current sort of Russian leaders, predating Putin, after all, going right back to the beginning of the 1990s. He never seemed to have campaigned for any of the sort of promotions and jobs he gets. They just sort of magically descend upon him. So two very, very different styles. And Prigozhin decided to use his black PR operation to leak phone film footage of Shoigu's kids, and then make sort of claims about, why aren't they sort of, basically enjoying themselves while other people are dying, and why aren't they sort of fighting and such like. At which point it seems to be that military intelligence hacked the phones of Prigozhin's kids, who likewise enjoyed the kind of pampered, tasteless excesses of the current Russian elite, you know, partying in Dubai and everything else. And there was one particular bit about Prigozhin's daughter, the story, which I thought, oh, that's a good story. Oh, let's throw that in, it's a good story. It has to be said, it did not redound at all to the credit of Prigozhin's daughter. And this is a point where Anna said, look, you know, basically, she's a non-combatant. You know, her crime is to just happen to be who her dad is, and such like. We shouldn't really go all out. And it broke my heart, and I will never forgive you for it. But nonetheless, ultimately, you were right. No, but I mean, but again, for me, that illustrates this business about the fact that we come from different approaches, and some of us are classier than others, and we have different expertises and so forth. But again, it's through that process of just simply reiterative writing over. Fortunately, we didn't have massive disagreements about, you know, the essence of Prigozhin or whatever. Now, is there anything you want to add, or shall we throw it open to questions from the audience?
I mean, just kind of, yeah. I mean, really, one thing I wanted to add. One chapter that took a lot of back and forth was precisely that moment of Prigozhin being asked or tasked by the Kremlin, and to what extent. I mean, again, we both understood that this is a relationship where they came together, they met each other halfway. But that halfway, which is it? And I was leaning more towards, as I tend to, towards the initiative from below. That I think, in some ways, at least. Prigozhin was interested in doing something of the sort even before he was tasked, and I think that ultimately this kind of back and forth between us, it made the chapter a lot more solid, because this is what we don't really see today. We want clear answers in a subject where there really aren't any, and I think this kind of mutual verification that we had really, I'm really proud of where we kind of, what we achieved with that. And especially, throughout the book, if I, for instance, was getting carried away with Putin's 1990s belief in democratic principles, and Mark kind of had to stop me. Where's your evidence for that? Again, the process is, a lot of the time, where are we? We're asking each other, where's your evidence? And I think this was a very valuable experience, just not only for us, but I hope for the book as well. Mark and I come from, me as a journalist, Mark as a security expert. I look at the process from the bottom up. Mark tends to talk to the generals, whereas I tend to talk to the captains and the majors. And that's kind of where where our perspectives might differ, but ultimately where they come together, because we've got both sides of that story, which I hope we've managed to carry across in this book. Thank you.
Great. So what will you do? Now, we've got some time now for questions from the audience, but also I think people watching online can also send in questions. Because there are people watching online, I would ask you that when you're going to ask your question, please wait until you've got the microphone, otherwise they won't be able to hear you. So, does anyone want to ask a question, or do we just go to the bar? No, okay, fine. Well, we'll start with the front row. Thanks, sir.
Well, thank you very much. That was an excellent conversation. I have so many questions I could ask, but one that sort of struck me looking at Prigozhin's face, actually, on the Downfall book there. I think for me, and for the people that were introduced to him post the invasion, the kind of defining moment is him in this this sort of video of him in a field, in a jacket, puce-faced, just sort of hollering at the camera, gesticulating wildly to some rockets beside him, screaming about Shoigu and Gerasimov, and there's a lot about the video, but one of the things that stood out to me about it is that it's almost quite funny. There's a kind of comedic element to Prigozhin that I do think he seems to have played up somewhat, in that he almost made himself into something of a meme, which then that began to influence the kind of turbo patriots and that. So I was just wondering to ask both of you, do you think that he intentionally plays into that aspect, or did, to try and raise his own profile amongst that sort of turbo patriot crowd?
Okay, shall we take a bunch of several questions? Yeah, so there's one a bit further down. Anna.
Thank you. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you talked about how you wrote the book, but how you researched it, because I understand he wasn't an easy man to find out about whilst he was alive, and then obviously there were slight logistical issues by the time he was not alive.
Okay, and fine. We'll take three at once.
Sure. I'm just interested in what you think is the future of PMCs in Russia, given that even in Ivan the Terrible had his own Wagner in the form of the Oprichniki. There seems to be a propensity for Russia as a state to sort of develop these organizations.
Okay. Do you want to start picking 1, 2, or 3 of those? As you. Sorry.
I'm not sure he kind of plays into the comic memes of himself, but I think this kind of exaggerated violence, the sledgehammer, with which a mercenary was beaten to death by other Wagnerites for trying to leave. This is something he certainly likes to hyperbolize. He certainly liked to hyperbolize, to his to kind of bolster the threat of himself. This kind of oversized image. So I think that I think it served him. It served the kind of the Wagner brand. I think it helped recruitment. Mark, is there anything you want to add to this? What do you think?
I'll do a bunch of answers after you've done a bunch. If there's something more you want to say.
Okay, sure. And then the other one, how did we research it? Well, I'll say on my end, I had by that point written the book Hybrid Warriors, which was about Russia's reliance on non-state actors in Ukraine since 2014, and I'd had a lot of material about volunteers and also Wagnerites who first started out as volunteers fighting on together with the pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine, and then went over to join Wagner when the opportunity arose. But I felt like addressing the whole issue of Wagner, that was a little bit much, so I didn't really talk about it in this book, but I had accumulated a lot of research by that point. But then when we both came into it, there's a lot that you can find by reading open source accounts. We had some contacts, we did some interviews with people close to Prigozhin, as to the extent that we could. But I think that ultimately the point that really comes down to is that you have to read and just listen and take at face value what people are saying about their own experiences. You can't fully trust you have to triangulate and verify, but when people are talking about their own motivations, about why they're doing something, you've got to kind of try to understand, put yourself in their shoes for a moment, which is in part why writing this book was so difficult. Just mentally and morally finding yourself thinking about what would I do if I was this person, and then kind of coming out of that. And then the final question, the future of PMCs. despite the wonderful mention of the Oprichnina, which I could talk about for hours, I think I will leave this question to Mark to address. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I'll do it in inverse order. I mean, the interesting thing is that Ivan the Terrible creates the Oprichnina and then he purges it, precisely because it spins out of control and becomes a threat to him. So there's all sorts of great historical parallels there. No, I mean, look, at the moment, there is a huge array of different PMCs notionally in Russia. The fact of the matter is the Kremlin has learnt one of the key lessons of this, which is it is unwise to allow minigarchs with poor impulse control to have their own armies. So what you've got is essentially a degree of nationalization. Wagner's operations in Africa have been sort of brought under the aegis of a new agency called, with stunning historical irony, the Africa Corps, which is basically run by military intelligence, the GU. So although you still technically have the same operations and the same contracts, bit by bit they're more being brought under the Africa Corps. So the idea is you still have the kind of political and economic gains, but it's much more carefully monitored. And the massive array of PMCs, volunteer battalions, other things that are sort of currently fueling the war in Ukraine, the thing is, these are in many ways just simply different ways of recruiting people. Even the most important sort of non-Wagner mercenary organization, Revolt, which was basically thrown in at the beginning of the invasion in 2022 and decimated, it exists really as a franchise now. People think they're joining Revolt, and then they find themselves actually being sort of allocated to a different unit. And these are all part of the so-called Expeditionary Assault Corps. On the Mayak Intelligence website, there is actually a report that we wrote for US Army European Command on private military companies after Prigozhin, called Prigozhin's Children. So if you are really feeling insomniac and you want detail, go and find that there. It's freely downloadable. In terms of the writing, the process, I mean, you know, and Anna has given a good run through. It's also worth noting that there were a fair number of Western sources, and I will sort of keep it nice and sort of shady like that, who are also perfectly willing to give their own impressions of quite what was going on. Because again, this is the thing, that the fact of the matter is that you never have too many sources. And even the ones that you discount, at least you need to have to think about it to discount, and that's part of the whole process of knowing, sort of, or beginning to get a better sense of what kind of a beast you're talking about. In terms of the sort of the Prigozhin meme, yeah, I mean, he was in his own way, I hesitate to say a showman, but certainly a performer. I don't know if you've seen for example, videos of him addressing convicts. You know, very much he's playing that role of the I'm one of you, you know, I'll take you out alive, but I'm not promising you'll be coming back alive. You know, I mean, very, very clearly and performatively playing to the machismo of those people. Whereas at other times, as we've heard, when he was the restaurateur, he was the self-effacing maitre d' figure who was there just in order to make your experience, if you are rich and powerful enough, make your experience as perfect as possible. He knew how to play roles. Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure he ever thought of himself as comic, except maybe when he was modeling those various bizarre disguises that came to light when his home was raided. But no, I don't think this is a man who took himself lightly, it has to be said. Okay, let's sort of try again, just to make your life easier. There's like three more or less along this. So right at the back, the gentleman in white, and then there's at the very back, gentleman in white on the aisle. Sorry, I'll come to you next. Okay.
Hello, thank you. You both talked, especially in the first extract Arnold read out, about class and about the exclusivity of Russian ruling class now and in the past of the nomenclature and before that the Tsarist aristocracy. How much continuity do you see in Putin's court with what came before, and how much is new? How's it changed?
Yeah, what are the implications for Putin's position? The implications of the Prigozhin episode. short term or long term, is his position weaker or damaged at all as a result?
Okay.
Thank you. My question was that, if I remember correctly, Russian far-right groups embrace the visuals in terms of when they're constructing their identity. They embrace visuals of not only far-right and neo-fascism, but also sometimes neo-paganism. And this is especially prevalent in the Telegram channels and the kind of image, the kind of brand they're trying to put forward. Would you say neo-paganism was in any way an important identity marker for Wagner? And I think the question that comes from that is, what kind of legacy did Wagner leave specifically among the Russia's and maybe even European far-right groups?
Shall I have the first stab at this one?
I'll start actually with that one. Could you, I'm sorry.
No, microphone.
Could you just repeat your questions, a couple of words I didn't catch about the Russian far-right groups?
Yes, it was. Thank you. It was a question about identity and constructing an identity that for some of Russia's far-right groups, as we can see in Telegram, it's not only neo-fascist and kind of like very violent interpretation of orthodoxy and the war of conquest that's evident, but also neo-paganism and blatant neo-paganism. Is that important for Wagner?
I'll try to address this. I think that Russian far-right groups, just as Russia's liberal opposition, they are in very many ways splintered, and there's a whole spectrum. I mean, if you look, for instance, at the trajectories of some of the, take even the moderate nationalists, the late Konstantin Krylov, or look at Yegor Kholmogorov, for instance. Krylov, by the way, was a Zoroastrian, just, you know, since you mentioned neo-paganism, which I think it is an interesting strand. I think what they all have in common is that even as they pick fights with each other, and if you look at the trajectories of any of these nationalist thinkers, you'll see them joining one group and then moving along to another, or having a fight with this one, and there's just all sorts of bickering, and you know, what they all have in common is precisely looking for a national identity. Who are we Russians? Do we define ourselves along ethnic lines? Do we define ourselves along the lines of citizenship? Among nationalist groups, I think this is an open question. There are some, you know, the more neo-Nazi, the more ultra, the violent neo-Nazi groups who do make it very much about blood and soil. You know, and then there are the more the more moderates who are simply asking precisely what is it that makes Russians Russian? Is it a set of values? Is it borders? Is it? But we've got to have something, and currently we don't. And this is what I think they're saying. So I think a lot of the symbolism that they're toying with. You know, I think it is significant, but it's significant in the sense that it's a process, not an end. And we're going to see this play out in, you know, in very many bloody ways, as we're already seeing. But I think in some ways this is also a global process that is not unique to Russia. You know, that it is very much about toying with past symbols as we look for an identity. So the next one, Mark, is there something you would like to add to that? Okay. So was Putin weakened or damaged by Prigozhin's revolt? I think initially he was, but I think he's learned a lot of lessons. If we saw what he was doing in the summer of 2023, by the fall, like a year ago, basically, he had re-emerged from this year-long seclusion. Periodically, when Putin is faced with crises, he tends to not so much fully abdicate, but recede from public view. And this can be, in some ways, disastrous, and I believe in some ways it contributed to these tensions that ultimately led to Prigozhin's failed mutiny. I think that in the long run, however, Putin had learned his lessons. He reemerged to play a more robust public role, started once again acting as arbiter, which is something that he'd been doing quite well since the beginning of his rule. I think that in the long term, will he be weakened by this specifically? Once again, I think not so much specifically as in the sense that Prigozhin raised perennial questions about the Kremlin's sense of purpose and the hollowness of what it is offering to Russia and its future. That is a vulnerability that Putin currently lives with and will, ultimately be, whether Putin or somebody after him will have to deal with. And finally, class. This is a good question. I think that the late Soviet Union was a very certainly caste society, and this has not really gone away. If you are of the intelligentsia, there are certain expectations you have to conform to, and in some ways, this is still the case. Muscovites, who are the sons and daughters of the journalists that became famous during the 1990s, or the liberal politicians, they will be, kind of in their own group. The creative class that revolted against Vladimir Putin in 2011, 2012, while kind of starting to make inroads more with people of other classes and people from the regions, there were still, great many boundaries. If you recall, in 2011, 2012, there was a meme, Sveta from Ivanova, who was a pro-Putin activist, who was filmed and asked, why do you like United Russia and Putin? And she said, oh, well, we're dressing more better, literally. And her bad grammar in Russian was ridiculed by the, progressive creative class. But what it actually showed was just how much animosity there was among the urban liberal protesting class towards people who are simply poorer and from the regions. The Kremlin exploited this class divide and exploited it really well, so much so that ultimately it turned away, it basically started, it turned to the factory workers at Uralvagonzavod as the new base for the Kremlin and for especially for later on for its as it went into a war footing, that it was doing this for the factorymen, for the working people, for the simple people of the Russian who worked with the Russian soil. And I think this is a very important division. I think it's the sense of the continuity certainly changed these class divides, and I think it is improving. People are starting to talk more to each other, but it's still an issue. These divides still will need to be overcome. So it's still a process.
Thanks. I mean, there's very little I would say to add to the class dimension from what Anna said. I'm a little bit more, I suppose one would call it optimistic in terms of damaging Putin's position, in that, yes, he has learnt lessons, but this was a mutiny that was in a way Putin's fault. He had been told by many people that the Prigozhin-Shoigu feud was becoming dangerous. And precisely because, in classic Putin style, when there wasn't an easy answer, he hid from it. And he hoped that it would just magically sort itself out. But then, I would say even more crucially, was when the mutiny did happen, what was striking was that although there was no great flocking to support Prigozhin, nor was there much enthusiasm in actually resisting him. I mean, on that fateful Saturday, you had Zolotov, former Putin bodyguard, now head of the National Guard, basically on the phone to local commanders, or trying to get through to local commanders to get them to do something to block this force that was heading towards Moscow. and they were assiduously trying to make damn sure that they could not be contacted by phone. I'm sure there's a lot of people who's claiming that the dog ate their phone or something, because they didn't want to get orders that they would actually have to either obey or directly oppose. So it was better to sort of basically keep your head down and see what happens, which is exactly what we saw on the first day of the 1991 August coup. I mean, on that day, for example, the Soviet, as was then militia still, the Soviet police had record levels of illness. As everyone was thinking, well, I don't necessarily want to go out and arrest my next door neighbor, but nor do I want to look as if I'm sort of siding with the other side. So, let's give it a day and see how things pan out. And once it became clear that momentum was against the conservative hardline coup, they felt more comfortable coming out against it. So I think if this was like a vote of confidence in Putin, what we saw was much of the security apparatus abstain. And I think that was important, because this is the first real test that Putin, the Russian people, and indeed the rest of us watching, had of what his level of support really was. We'd always assumed that basically Putin had the security apparatus in his pocket. Now it's clear that it's not quite so clear, if I can use that expression. And I think people will have learnt that. It doesn't mean to say there's going to be a coup next Thursday. It would take a very serious chain of events to create that, but it's less unimaginable than it was before the mutiny, and that matters because, so much of the control of an authoritarian regime rests on making opposition unimaginable. And very finally, on the sort of far right, I mean, it's worth noting, after all, that Wagner had within it a unit called Rusic, which was drawn explicitly from, neo-Nazi pagan types, phenomenally brutal, unfortunately also actually rather effective. So it is clear that there are units that really sort of created that as a sort of identity. But on the other hand, I mean, I think this is to go back to Anna's point about sort of why they do that, why the paganism and so forth. I mean, I've spent a certain amount of time sort of looking at both the combat reenactment societies within Russia, but also the role-playing game sort of community. And it's interesting that there's a lot of talk about paganism, neo-paganism and the like there. And it's very hard, honestly, to divine how much of that is genuine, that actually this is a really held belief. How much is this just to be edgy and different and so forth? And how much of it is designed to be explicitly and directly transgressive? The same reason why Vori criminal tattoos at one point would have the Virgin Mary during Tsarist Russian times, because you want to be irreligious and blasphemous, and then you'd have Lenin and Marx in Soviet times, because that was blasphemous. This is blasphemous now, as you have a kind of a stodgy state Russian orthodoxy becoming essentially the national religion of Putin's elite. So, I mean, I honestly don't have a full answer, because it's not, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on this. But the interesting thing is precisely that we see everything from genuine belief through to this as being a kind of symbolic rebellion against the official order. And no doubt people will actually, in some ways, navigate between these various positions. Okay, how are we doing time-wise? We've got 11 minutes, so I think there's quite a few questions still. So we will try and be shorter and briefer in our replies. Okay, so I can see let's do some on this side and then a batch on that side next. So someone in a stripy shirt in the middle. Yeah. And blue jumper. Yes.
Prigozhin's dead, but Wagner seems to be carrying on, and, well, we can still see its influence in Africa. How do you believe the West should deal with this, and deal with PMCs as opposed to the Russian military in general? How should the approach differ?
Okay, there was someone next to you, I think, yes. Oh.
As Prigozhin is starting his march northward and it's gathering surprising steam quickly and commanders aren't picking up their phones, do you have any inkling as to what he envisioned a possible end game might be? Because it just seems...
Okay, and anyone else on that side? Okay, we'll take those two and then we'll take the batch over there. I mean, I'll lead on this one quickly. Wagner in Africa. Why do certain African leaders engage Wagner or now Africa Corps? The answer is because they actually provide something that they want. This is a wider metaphor for actually how Russia continues to have support in what they call the global majority. We would call largely the global south. Manifest in the fact that we've got, at this very moment, the BRICS summit taking place in Kazan. It's actually that we in the West have created the opportunities, and the Russians just simply pick them up where they happen to be lying. There are authoritarian regimes that don't really want to be lectured by the West. The last remaining true cynics in the West, the French, have been withdrawing, and in a way, often it's Wagner that steps into the gap in terms of security provision, whether it's bodyguarding, suppressing populations, fighting insurgents, or whatever else. The thing is, you bring in Wagner, they will have a go at doing the job, and much of the time they actually do a decent job. There are some big blunders, like Mozambique. They're willing to take casualties. I mean, this is it. When we saw, for example, recently, there was a case of some sort of serious casualties, and people were saying, oh, it's the beginning of the end for the Russians there. No, actually. In some ways, ironically, whereas we in the West, two people stub their toe and we're thinking about pulling out, the fact that the Russians are willing to take casualties and still continue is well regarded. They're not going to give you lectures about diversity and equity. I'm caricaturing here, but nonetheless, this is often the perspective, the perception. Quite the opposite. They understand that they have to kick back a certain proportion of what's paid to the right people. From that point of view, actually, they provide a service. And in terms of what we can do, most of the discussion is about sticks. Oh, should we be sanctioning them? Should we be calling them a terrorist structure or whatever? The trouble is, if we do that, someone else will fill that vacuum. Maybe it'll be a Chinese mercenary organization, because they're beginning to arise, including, I must admit, my favorite, Genghis Khan Security Services. I mean, I thought brilliant. Why don't we have, Attila the Hun? Anyway, but, it will be someone else if the reasons why Wagner is there are still there. So that's what we should be thinking about, which probably means actually making good on more of our promises. Prigozhin, what was he imagining? See, his plan originally was actually to basically kidnap Shoigu and Gerasimov. They were going to be in Rostov-on-Don. And I think he was basically going to take Rostov, the city that he did actually take, without a shot being fired, and with Shoigu and Gerasimov in his hand, essentially negotiate with Putin. This is not, if you go back to the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, mercenary captains would often, shall we say, coercively renegotiate their contracts. And this was, I think, just the equivalent. He thought that he would basically be able to convince Putin that, look, I'm more useful than these deadweight. He very quickly, basically once Putin came out on Saturday morning and made it clear, called this treachery and such like, basically at that point he knew that the game was up. So he was starting to try and open negotiations to what was going to be the best deal that he could negotiate to climb down. He kept up the march on Moscow, which is only about a couple of thousand men anyway. He wasn't ever going to actually take Moscow, but again, as a sort of symbolic pressure, because it's hard-nosed negotiation. But basically, by that point, it was just simply he was negotiating to try and keep his head out of the noose, which he managed for 2 months. I think that was really what was going on. Anna, what would you
I think there's not much I can add to what Mark said. I think you covered it perfectly. Except, one thing, and this kind of goes into the whole, we'll kidnap them and then see what we can negotiate. I think for Prigozhin, whatever the specific objectives were, this was also, as in any revolt, simply kind of a cry, a need to be taken seriously, need to be heard. And I think in Prigozhin's case, especially, it's, you know, it is yet unclear to what extent this was a continuation of his emotional outbursts that had preceded the actual march.
Yeah. So last batch of questions on this side, and then I'm afraid we will have to end. So first of all, we have, there's a hand there, and then there's two more across that I can see.
Brilliant. I found it absolutely fascinating to see the response of the people of Rostov at the arrival of Wagner. It almost looked like a carnival atmosphere. I was curious if you feel like that was emblematic of how Wagner would have been received in other parts of the country, or setting geography aside, had Wagner arrived in St. Petersburg, what would have the reception looked like?
Okay. And then long one there, and gentleman here at the front. So white shirt, and then...
Thanks. If the opportunity were to arrive in a sort of hypothetical situation and you got the opportunity to ask Putin a direct question about Prigozhin, what would you ask Putin?
Okay, cool. And gentleman with glasses here on the second row.
Thanks. With the benefit of 10 years hindsight, what sort of imprint do you think Prigozhin will have left on Russia and its society and its history? Will he have disappeared in the noise about the wider Ukraine war, or will there be a specific piece that one can point to?
Okay, what a perfect question to end on. Okay, Anna, do you want to take first step?
It's hard to tell what kind of response we would have seen elsewhere, but I would wager that it would have been different than in Rostov. If we're talking about Wagnerites showing up in St. Petersburg or even in the Moscow region, we have to understand Rostov is a, you know, as with a lot of Russian regions, there's a specific identity involved, one that is very, you know, for them, the conflict just across the border in Ukraine, this is very much deeply personal. There was a lot of there were a lot of fighters crossing the border into Donetsk and Lugansk regions from Rostov simply to support the pro-Russian separatists when the fighting broke out in 2014, and this was, you know, very much voluntary, and to the extent that in the beginning the Kremlin had to kind of even almost step in and try to stop them, although it obviously didn't. So I think that the response would have been incredibly different. And again, it would have depended very, very much on how successful it was deemed to be and where the wind was blowing in the corridors of the Kremlin. I think in Rostov at the time, it's just people were kind of caught in a disarray. Where is this going and what's going on? It wasn't about simply taking sides. This was about simply the admiration that they had for the Wagnerite fighters, which Putin subsequently kind of continued. He called them patriots, even though he called Prigozhin a traitor. Secondly, what would I ask Putin? Well, considering that I one time almost asked him a question but didn't and ran away when he turned to me, this is a hard one to answer for me, especially since Putin never really quite tells the truth. I guess with Prigozhin, I would ask, what were you thinking? How did you think this was going to end? Given that this was clearly a man who felt that he was not appreciated, where did you think this was going? And finally, the imprint. I mean, as we've said before, I think that despite who Prigozhin was, and despite the time that passes, I think that the questions he raised in 2023 are lasting, and they will be raised again. So I think in that sense, and especially given that people still lay flowers at his grave, this is a failed mutiny that has already become historic, and I think many of the questions that it was addressing will have to be addressed again once at the end of this war, when it ends, and afterwards. And on that, I would end, and tomorrow.
Okay, yeah, Rostov-on-Don. Again, I wonder what had happened if just one platoon of soldiers had tried to stop Wagner and there'd been a firefight. I mean, I think so much, and often history turns on these, often very, very specific but small hinge points. As it was, they were able to roll in, the troops confined themselves to their barracks, same for the National Guard, the police just basically confined themselves to directing traffic, essentially. And therefore, it kind of, it could feel like a carnival-ish type sort of thing, and, these sort of cool heroes, which, we have to acknowledge, unfortunately, a lot of people did think of the Wagner as, whatever we might think, were there in their numbers, and they could take selfies and everything else. It was almost that sense of being there at a historic moment, almost regardless of quite what that historic moment was. But as I said, I think things could have been very, very different. And I think, if we were talking about Moscow or St. Petersburg, that would have been a different thing, because this would exactly have been an unwelcome intrusion of a war that seems far away. Whereas, as Anna has said, for Rostov-on-Don, Rostov has been the headquarters, essentially, of the officially and unofficially and then officially of the first undeclared war effort during the Donbass era, and then during the quote-unquote special military operation. It's always been Donbass that has been the focus of it. So in some ways, these are all people who had been living with the war for a long time. A question for Putin. Why did you ban me in 2022? This is the thing. I mean, I would love to be able to market myself, because I was in the first list of Brits who were banned indefinitely from Russia. I'd love to be able to market myself as the man Putin fears. But I'm sure he has never heard of me, but some junior desk officer at the Foreign Ministry was told, come up with a list of whatever it was, 24 snotty Brits we can ban. No, I mean, again, if we go back to that crucial moment, the interesting thing is that Putin strikes a deal with Prigozhin to end the mutiny, which is ridiculously generous. And my suspicion is he did so just because he just desperately wanted this problem to go away. And it was only afterwards that he thinks, no, this is making me look bad, this makes me look weak. Actually, I have to reassert my power by basically killing him. But there's some suspicion that he always had that in mind. I don't really think so, but I would love to know. So basically, my answer, assuming we can actually get an honest response from him, is, did you really always plan to kill him? Or was there a sort of a possible world in which Prigozhin could have restored himself to his sort of, not quite, but some favoured position? And finally, 10-year imprint. I would love to think that there's no real imprint, that essentially it's just something that's gone in history, and that, as we watch the inauguration of President Navalny, it can be that. Unfortunately, I don't think actually that will be the case. But I think precisely the point is, it's not what Prigozhin will have done, it's how will Prigozhin's mutiny have been reinterpreted. Will tell us a lot about what sort of Russia it is in 10 years' time. If it's still, God help us all, Putin in power there, then it will probably be precisely a misguided man who took patriots in the wrong direction. Whereas, but informally, the different opposition forces will be trying to co-opt Prigozhin's memory, his shade, his shadow to their cause. If Putin has gone, it very much depends on what. I mean, I imagine that what will replace Putin will be essentially some opportunist kleptocrats, not rabid turbo patriots, but people who precisely will actually want to keep Prigozhin at arm's length. So the honest answer is I don't know, but I think it'll tell us a lot about what's happening in Russia at that time. And on that note, I regret, I'm afraid we are past our time.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna and Mark.